This is building query for September 25, 2020. The agenda for which I tweeted out earlier in the day, but I think we want to focus on Qri.dev, a sketch of a site to outline query specs and help kind of our dev community get oriented around different aspects of our work that are a little harder to understand on GitHub. That essentially a main driver. It's a really pretty website that I think Brendan will be giving us a little tour of. So hopefully we can turn this into a kind of demo for that. And otherwise reviewing Sprint S work in addition.
Yeah, I think we should probably start with Sprint S and then apologies for the sirens. And then go into some of the specs talk, because I think the main, we're going to show the website, but the main purpose is to sort of like get a conversation going about some of these really hard problems that we've come across surrounding identity and key pair infrastructure and logbook, which are very in the weeds, but very important to sort of talk through and figure out. And I think this is a great place to do it. But before we get to that, just quickly, I'm just going to share my screen and we will talk through. Share, go. We'll talk through this last 2 weeks worth of Sprint. So this was Sprint S, and we had to focus on a number of things this sprint, many of which got finished. We had 30 things in the done column, which is great. Lots of stuff in progress, and then a bunch of stuff that we sort of were thinking about getting to, and we're playing with a somewhat different format for the to-do column this sprint. But the main focus this sprint was to try and get some specs stood up, get some documentation improved, and sit in as tight a feedback loop as possible with some of our key users who are trying to do cool things to query, and make sure that we sort of are attentive and enabling of any of those cool things. There's lots to go through. Does anybody, I'd rather than just stealing all the credit, do we want to go around the room with some of the core contributions and that everyone feels like they can think of off the top of their head that they finished in the last week or two? And I think, Daniel, we can start with you, because you have made a wonderful open source contribution that I'd like to sort of call out and draw attention to before we even go any further.
Okay.
Daniel, do you want to describe what you did this week to make query better?
Which one are we talking about, the Go or the Python one?
Either or.
Okay. Well, so in the Go one, I decided, since I was waiting on reviews for the Python, I thought I'd take a look at what I could do with Go, and I just found a bug that seemed like it was something I could plausibly figure out, and it was one where there was an index error on a join, and I just dug into it, and it looked like there was a variable that held column names, and it was longer than the one that held it was shorter than the one that held the column values. And so then I looked at the file and I said, oh, okay, so there's a discrepancy between the two. So I have a tentative fix. Oh no, well, that's just a name thing I found along the way.
Oh, cool.
This one's not as interesting. But so anyway, so I put in a tentative fix. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess it's good enough. I don't know. I know Dustin didn't say it was a bad fix, so I'll put in a test. I'm working on that, because I thought maybe it was like too blunt of a fix. Like maybe there's more of a root cause, but I don't know.
So first, thank you so much for even attempting to fix it. Two, apologies about the Python reviews that are still outstanding. They're on my to-do list, but just got kind of lost in the shuffle temporarily.
No worries.
I'm not super familiar with the Python code, so I don't know if this is like the better fix, if a better fix exists, or if this is kind of like the right way to do it. Which is mostly why I want to have like unit tests, because like it'll be good to kind of like see what this causes to work and what not to work. Even something just like for this behavior will be a good start, so that if we determine in the future that, you know, there's some other way it should be done, we can at least like verify that things don't get worse in the route to that better future. But yeah, it's good just to have like incremental improvements for now to fix these problems. Yeah, cool stuff.
Yeah, great work. Thank you very much, Daniel, for your incredible contributions. This is really appreciated on all of behalf.
And then the Python one, perhaps more interesting, at least aesthetically. I'm curious what you think about that, the tab completion thing. Is that?
Yes. That would be super fun. We need to look into this and we need to get this in.
Yeah, I want to finish these PRs like hopefully today. The tab completion is especially cool. I like that a lot, but a little bit outside of my knowledge area. But
okay. Well,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not that familiar with it either, but it looked like, just from playing with the behavior of it, it looked like IPython and Jupyter can both tab complete dictionaries, though it has, you see there's like a bunch of junk in there. And so I was playing with different variations of it, and it seemed like this is the best way. I mean, this is the best I could come up with. If you guys did not accept dashes in names, then I could do something better where I actually started working on this till I realized that you could put dashes in names, because then you could have like Python members, like variables, or what do you call it? Just like a data attribute of like, you do qri.repository.b5.
And just tab all the way through, right? Because then you don't.
Is that because it would match the Python identifier rules? Then is that?
Yeah, I think it sounds
interesting.
Like it.
What do you mean identifier rules?
Like literally the definition of a symbol of an identifier symbol. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Dustin.
Right. Yeah, because in Python you can use underscores but not dashes.
Right. Yeah. That's what I meant. Yep. That was what I ran into. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll try the same thing with like a dictionary of dictionaries, but then it's just there's so few names compared to, like, if you have, I don't know, it seemed like it was harder to find the stuff among all the noise in that way. So I just went with just the full name of the repo with the slash in there, and it works well enough. At least on my end. I don't know, maybe it'll look different. Maybe it's implemented differently in other people's computers.
I will definitely play with this. I'm very interested in tab completion, that's for sure.
Cool.
And we'll make a point of getting you some feedback on this. This sprint was actually, we intended to sort of really sit with user feedback this sprint, and the Python client wasn't very high on our list, as we had spent some time 2 weeks ago, or was that a whole, oh my gosh. I think we had basically this latest week has been sort of not so much Python focused, and then the week prior we were spitting out a video. But we'll be back on it in the next sprints. Yeah. Cool. Anybody else want to shout out something cool that they did? And I'll pull it up on screen.
I want to say that Ramfox's fix for validate is awesome and is going to make it easier to fix other problems that are related to like get and stuff like that.
Thanks.
I reviewed that, which is why I brought it up.
Do you want to talk about it, Ramfox?
Sure. Basically, my whole thing was there's just a bunch of fixes that I tried to get in these past 2 weeks. One of them being this fix where you weren't able to validate a data set, validate a body if you had a linked, checked out data set that had no history. And the fix for that is actually going to give us some good bones to be able to fix a couple other issues that have to do with needing to have a schema, but needing to generate one because no schema was provided. So it was really just a refactor of pulling out some code that already existed and just setting it up in a way that it could be used by other things.
Absolutely, and a lot of this came from direct feedback.
Yeah, which was awesome.
User Abaruso, who was working with validate and had a number of questions about the validate command and how it could work or should work. We have since made some improvements this sprint to how validate works. I'll check in with the bits that Casey was building on. How do I actually show that thing? Yeah, this link. Yes, I want to click this link. So this is what it looks like now. Query validate can spit out. It spits out a more useful format than it did before, and that format just gives you a table of validation information. And the table is smart enough to know that if the data you're talking about is tabular, it shows you row and column instead of the path delimited versions that it'll use in JSON. The other thing that it can do now is query validate can spit out structured data, which is useful for people who want to use it in other tools. So in this case, we're validating with a JSON format output, and that gives you a JSON data structure that allows you to work with the validation data. Or you can ask it for a CSV file of the actual validation data, which is a little easier than the super hierarchical JSON if you need. And then this is where I ran into the bug while I was cutting this very quick video, and Casey fixed it. So yeah, thank you for the fix. Yeah. Anybody else? Something fun they did this week?
I just want to comment that I think Validate's such a good tool that people can use that's sort of unique to Qri that can help you. I think is going to even help people build data sets in Qri while they're using it. And it's just super helpful for when people are working with CSVs. And I think it's just delightful, to quote something that the way that Brendan talks about stuff. It's delightful.
Delectable. Awesome. Awesome. Anyone else?
I could talk about the integrations tab.
Yeah. I'm going to go look at it while you talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, just bring it up. Just go to any data set.
I've been using for 6Ks.
That's right. Any
integration.
data set.
Any data set. Chris, what'd you do?
So yeah, there's a new tab you'll see in addition to the ones that were there before. We have one called integration, and if you click on it, it's more or less an auto-generated documentation page. And probably the most useful snippet is the CSV download link. So we do have an API on qri.cloud, and you can now just copy and paste this, go run with it and use it in any tool that speaks CSV. So I think Brendan's about to demo that right now with datawrapper or Kepler?
Yeah, just did a download of. I could demo it with one of those. We could do datawrapper.
Yeah, but in addition to the CSV download link, there's also some really simple code for importing one of these cloud-hosted CSVs into Python or Python in a Jupyter environment, RStudio. There's quick import code for getting turning a SQL data set or turning a query data set into a PostgreSQL table using a little tool called pgfutter, which does some column type guessing. So these are all just kind of quick and dirty things to put this data set to work, and then also some copy and pastable CLI commands if you just want to pull or get the body quickly. So it's there. It's a start. I think there'll be plenty of opportunities to improve on it as people start using it.
How are you?
It's so good. New chart. Let's show this really quick. How do I do? I do this, right? And then I paste this. I need all is true. Or does that just work?
Good.
Oh well.
Good.
And I click proceed. And it gives me a chart, I hope. See what happens. Maybe we won't wait on this. Anyone else? While we're waiting on my local machine to do a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it kind of.
Going once, going twice.
I mean,
Sold. We did a bunch of cool stuff. The sprint was really good. I think we shipped a number of useful changes.
Messy drawings that
yeah. Can everyone hear me okay? My office coworker causing too much noise.
We can hear it too. Just let her know.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So with that, I think we have one last thing to show, which is Qri.dev, which is our new website specifically for specifications. And yeah, this is going to be our hopefully home for the canonical definition of what query is. We've been working a bunch on this. Its GitHub repository is here, qri.io/specs. This is the actual data set. This is the actual repository that backs it. It needs a README. But if we extend all these, we can sort of look through some of the concepts that we're defining. And ideally today, we were going to spend a bunch of time talking about public key infrastructure and the way that that relates, and a number of other things on here. Sorry, I'm super distracted. But I think it's worth starting with sort of the way that I'd like to lay this whole site out, and a couple of things that are different. This is mainly for people who are working on query core implementations. Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm just gonna mute and go talk to my partner.
Fix it in post.
Okay, should be better. The joys of recording calls. Yeah, so with the spec site, we're hoping to sort of actually define things, but I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about what I'm hoping to do with this. And the first thing I'd like to do is currently our query core implementation is written in Go. And I'd like to actually have the spec be a little more agnostic so that we can stay focused on concepts and technologies and instead of on programming languages. That's not entirely possible everywhere, but I think QFS is the first place where we can actually like start to see some examples of how this might work and like explain something along the way. The other thing you may notice is the spec is intentionally aspirational. The spec that we're writing does not reflect the way that Qri works today, and it's not intended to. The way that Qri works today, if you want to know how Qri works today, you should use our documentation, which is at qri.io. If you want to understand the way that Qri is or is not broken, then that's source code. We look at the sort of current reference implementation, which is our Go, and the only implementation. But if you want to know how Qri is going to work one day, that is the spec document. And if you want to change how the spec looks, we write in RFC. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. But we've for a long time have had an RFC repository, which allows us, which stands for request for comments. That's qri.io/RFCs. And so this is where a number of folks, basically work on the design of Qri as a system. And so we have a number of these sort of RFCs that define Qri, make changes the way Qri is going to work. And these are proposals that get debated and accepted. What we, as a team, we've really been missing a spec, something that explains, hey, this is how this thing is supposed to work. And we've been running into a number of problems where we just really aren't on the same page. Specifically, I mean, this has really cropped up since the majority of the Qri team no longer works in one office. So we can't just turn around and say, hey, how does this work? And I think that's a really good thing. I think it's a really, not that we don't work in an office, but it's a good thing that we get this actually written down and explicit somewhere. And that's what this spec is supposed to do. And so we should write it in a language agnostic way, and it should define canonical behavior. And you should, if you read this document and find something that is confusing or misleading, we should fix it. And the biggest problem that we're going into with this spec project is it's going to be unfinished for some time, and managing the way that it is unfinished or is finished is going to be one of the big sort of challenges. And so I'm going to try and sort of like clean this up over the coming days and actually remove pages that are just stubs and only put things here that are completed. I've been batting that around for a little while. The status of a specification can be a really hard thing to manage, and because it requires constant attention. But with that, I think one of the most fun ones to start with is actually QFS, which is the Qri file system abstraction. And we have been working on QFS for a little while. I just want to use this as a quick example of how I think these spec documents should work. I don't want to get too much into QFS because I actually think we should be talking about logbook and identity today. But I think this is the most complete document that we have so far in the spec. And so actually, yeah, we can start here. So I mentioned that this should be language agnostic. This document starts right off the bat with a language dependent. This is all Go code here that we're looking at, which is the definition of a file. But in the future, I think we should be moving towards using protocol buffers to define things. So this is an example of where I think we should actually get to. And specifically, gRPC has a lovely definition of a service and an endpoint. And I think this is a really nice and useful way to talk about both structures and data structures and services. And so if we think about the file system as a service, these are the types of things it should do. And this code is, because protocol buffers are a really nice match for this, because it's intended to be language agnostic, right? And so we really try to use super common definitions of stuff, and protocol buffers can theoretically be translated into a number of different languages. I'm not saying the Qri is going to use protocol buffers as core technology. I think the purpose here is for illustrative purposes only for now. We have a whole debate to have as a team whether we actually use that technology in the core implementation of Qri. But hopefully that makes sense. But I think specs should get pretty specific. And like this is a great example of where for a long time we've had a number of conventions with the way a path works in Qri. And a path is a very specific thing. If we look at a data set reference, it's the thing after, it's basically the thing that starts with /IPFS /hash. And we've had a number of places inside of the Go code base where a few places where folks have actually gone forward and written out the abbreviated or abridged Backus-Naur form, ABNF. I can't remember the proper form for it, but actually explaining sort of in a grammar how something should work. And so this is, as an example of where I think the spec should be in terms of granularity. I think when it comes down to something like defining a path, we should actually be able to get into a whole ABNF definition of what a path is. When we're talking about a data structure, we should have a definition of what that data structure is and then how it interacts with other things. And so it's a good definition of a path. Hopefully we should review it later. And then the next, like the rest of the spec should deal with how some of these things interact and should fully define some of this stuff. Again, this document is kind of unfinished, so it's like not the greatest, but it's a good starting point. Any questions on using protocol buffers, ABNF, spec format? Dustin?
For the BNF, are you using a slash to represent or?
So this, in this case, this would be
No,
a slash to represent or? Yes.
Yeah, not quoted.
Yes.
I think typically a vertical bar is used. I don't know if that, whatever.
Totally, I know.
More curious about the notation.
Yeah, in the RFC version of ABNF, it's a slash.
Oh.
Most people use a bar.
Did not realize.
Yeah, because bars are closer to a union type. Yeah, and particularly in this case, it's really confusing because this is like literal character slash and then a slash to delineate an or. So it's, I don't know, it's not great. I would happily switch this to bars. And this kind of stuff really matters because we're trying to make something really readable for, again, really, really, really low level, right? Like the actual expression of this is just, we should include an example here, but it's literally just slash IPFS slash path.
Right. I feel like I've seen BNF more in like textbooks or like white papers, and I think vertical bar is where I got that idea from. But,
totally. That's the thing I see more commonly. I was just reading through the Wikipedia because I wanted to do stuff like alpha and the number of, and
sure.
Yeah, we can debate the way that it works. I'm happy to. I want to make sure it's as clear as possible. So with that in mind, this thing is totally unfinished, but this is our new website, and look here, it's going to evolve a bunch, and I'm really excited to like have a thing that evolves that we can actually consider, and it builds on a whole bunch. There's a whole bunch here that we can look at. We have a definition of a data set. We have a definition of some basic data types, which is totally unfinished, but gets to some stuff we've had to deal with for a long time. It gets to different definitions of components. These are data set components. These are the types of body formats that are allowed. These are all the actual canonical fields inside of a data set. While this is pulled from a number of different places, but the whole goal here is to assemble, hey, how is this supposed to work? And if that isn't answered by this document, then we need to write until it is. Yeah, and so I think that kind of covers what I wanted to cover in terms of just showing the new website and the way it's going to work. Ideally, this will help us really understand how a lot of this ties together. Cool, demo of website, over. I think the next bit we need to talk about is moving to this problem of logbook versus identities versus key pairs, which is a big, messy conversation. And so I think we've had a number of places where this is, I'm gonna stop screen sharing briefly. So I think this is a conversation we've had a few times and have tried to like solve in a meaningful way, but it tends to sprawl and go everywhere. And so today, what I thought we would try to talk about is some of the stuff, lead off with some of the problems you had seen, Asmir, with our implementation of OAuth and the way that that's going to intersect with key pairs. And then I think the other set of problems we should get out on the table and described is the stuff you're running into, Dustin, with multiple logbook sort of identifier problems and basically logbooks ending up in bad states for a number of reasons. Can I tap the two of you to sort of talk about some of these things? And then we can see if we can't talk about a critical path that I think we need to solve to move forward.
Sure. I don't really have anything prepared, but I can give a couple comments on the troublesome bits that I've been encountering. So anyway, the whole story behind OAuth is just to set everybody up for being able to later automate stuff or delegate to some machine to push on your behalf and stuff like that. So that's mostly like plumbing and infrastructure for the upcoming logbook work, which will actually allow you to use multiple keys, delegate permissions, write branches, and all that fun stuff that's coming hopefully in the near future. The problems we're seeing with OAuth is essentially we don't really have a stable identifier for user, which is delineated from his credentials like public key and private key. And we bump into that regularly. And it's also one of the core problems that we're trying to solve with logbook update, because that would allow us to kind of like separate the user from the actual credentials and then being able to write on behalf of that user with multiple credentials and stuff like that. And Cloud is a really good place to kind of like just show or highlight all those issues, because we have not one but several types of like user identifiers that we're shuffling around. 3, so it doesn't count them. While it works okay right now, it does get confusing, and sometimes you wonder which one is like the real or the more important one, and it mostly depends on the flow and thing you're trying to do. And that's really troublesome, because sometimes you need both or the other or whatever to kind of like join functionalities and explore new possibilities, which doesn't really make it possible to do that kind of like space. So the idea is to kind of like try to shift towards some sort of like one user ID that we're going to like favor, and sort of like have everything surround that instead of like just being a combination of multiple. So that's a long story behind it, but the short story is we need to figure out how profile IDs should be linked to key pairs, and how that will interact with like delegating those key pairs, set users like permission or authorization to other key pairs. So yeah, hope that helps.
That's really helpful, I think, for setting the stage. And Dustin, before we get to you, I just want to repackage what you just said, Asmir, sort of get at what we're talking about here. We're talking about collaboration. And so I think, Asmir, you mentioned key pair delegation. That's the sort of low level way of talking about what we're sort of trying to get at. And so the end thing that we're trying to get to users here is some mechanism by which, to define this technically, multiple key pairs can write to the same or similar data set histories. That has 3 sort of like main buckets of use case. First is just multiple users working on the same data set. Being able to have multiple people talk to the same data set. So I have B5/World Bank population. How do we enable Ramfox to contribute or write to that data set? The second one is some form of automation. How do I delegate, again, a key to some place that allows either a one-off or multiple writes to the history of a data set? And the last like obvious one that's on the near-term horizon is, what was it? Multiple automated pipelines, multiple users. There was something else. Oh, and the last one is delegating to yourself, being able to sort of say, hey, I would like to be able to make edits to the same data set history from different places. So can I edit something from cloud, and can I edit go to Qri Cloud and change the meta section of a data set and add a new version to that, and have that show up locally. All of these are examples of like the benefit is collaboration, being able to have multiple people work on the same thing. The mechanism, as Asmir was describing, is because we are built on key pair infrastructure, is some form of delegation strategy where we can establish a method by which a number of different keys can write to the same history. And that brought up this problem of a connection and a distinction that we need to make between what is a profile, like what does that word mean, profile, and what does a key do, and how do those things get connected? Asmir, is that an accurate repackaging what you just said?
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a little bit more user focused than what I said.
No, it's good because we want to interplay between the
weeds.
technical and and I think this is an in the weeds conversation, because Dustin, you've done the most work in tracing out how some of these problems intersect, and so I just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of the sort of high level thing that we get at the end of this conversation, which is if we get this right, we get collaboration out of it. So Dustin, you wrote a whole document on this and spent a whole bunch of time looking at this, and I think you and I are looking at the same document. Do you want to talk at all?
Oh, wait, should I have this open?
No, do whatever you want.
Oh, what's the question exactly?
I'd love to just get your take on this problem of collaboration,
Sure.
and some of the things that you think are the highest sort of like priority for fixing.
Well, so I have a lot of opinions about this whole subject, first of all. And I think the next step is going to be just like probably writing an RFC about it. But one thing is like there's just a lot mixed in with it. I think collaboration is somewhere we want to get to eventually, but we're kind of a few steps even from that, because the thing that's forefront on my mind is that there are these 2 problems that are very intertwined with logbook, where we have identity, and then we have the like the movement of activity across the network. Like logbook is a way to talk about changes that happen in a very lightweight way, where you can know about versions you don't have yet. You can know about changes made to data sets without getting those changes just yet. And that forms the basis for collaboration. But the way the code works right now, it's very intertwined with how identity works. And those ideas need to be better teased apart and turned into well-defined, rigorous concepts, just in order to avoid a bunch of problem cases we keep running into now. An example of that is that logbook, when it sees changes coming from someone else, it needs to know how to merge those into its existing data. And that makes assumptions about identity that don't match reality right now. So fixing that will fix a lot of the bugs we're seeing that can be caused by users having bad state. And that'll also inform how collaboration works, excuse me, in the future. So yeah, there's kind of like a couple of steps to take to get to that glorious future, but yeah, the foundation is being laid now. I could go into more detail if you want, but that's kind of like the problem from a high level as I'm concerned.
I think that's perfect. It's like a great description of it. I'm seeing some nodding. Yes, Casey's nodding. Yeah, and to like, just to give a concrete example of where, I just want to like lay out a concrete example of where this conflation really causes a problem right now. So the greatest way to cause a problem in Qri right now is to delete your Qri repository. And we can sort of talk through this really briefly. The common scenario we run into, which should be totally fine, but currently Qri falls over when you do this, is if I create a Qri repo, so I type Qri init, and then I start doing stuff, I create a dataset history.
Qri setup.
Qri setup, thank you. Right, init is, I've been using other people's tools for a little while. I type Qri setup, I hit enter, I choose beer name, or yeah, I choose username, I hit enter, cool. Already problems have emerged, but we'll worry about that in a second. I make a data set and I push that data set to cloud. And so in the process, I have authenticated as a user, and I have sent cloud my key pair, or my public key, so it knows, cool, I can connect this public key to this current notion of a profile, which is a cloud profile is a bit of an asterisk, but basically that's the thing that has your username. When you type qri.cloud/b5, you're talking to a data model on the Qri Cloud service. Then I delete that repository, or I switch to a different repository, and I type Qri setup again, and I use the name b5 again, and I authenticate to the Qri Cloud service again, and I push a data set. And now there are two key pairs connected to one identity, and we have a whole bunch of conflated notions that can show up there. The worst of this is if I create the same dataset name. Is that what you're gonna say, Dustin? Or...
No, I was actually gonna say it's worse than you just described it. It's not, we want it to be two key pairs attached to one identity, but what's actually happening now is we have two identities. And
right, sorry.
They use the same name, but they're actually separate identities, and that's where a lot of these bad states really originate from.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing we want to get at today. And both Asmir and Dustin have pointed out that it's this conflation of the notion of a username or a profile with a key pair that isn't explicit and isn't pulled apart is one major issue here. There's lots and lots with logbook, but I think we should just focus on that problem for now to understand it. Does that sound fair to everyone? Dustin's like,
I think there's a problem we have to solve first. Like I think solving multiple key pairs attached to an identity is not solvable until we have like stable identity.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's a better framing of the question.
Yeah,
so
we need to split it up. Just like the identity and key pair should cross only on one ID, and that's it.
Yes. Like for now, we need to have just a world where I can have one identity and one key pair, and if I move to another machine, we have a way to like make that possible. Yeah. And then the next step would be able to have multiple key pairs attached to the same identity. But I think the first definitely has to happen before the second.
Yes, and so we need to separate the idea of a key pair and an idea of an identity. Yeah. So let's talk about an identity, what it is, what it should be, and not what it is. Let's just talk about what it should be. and how it should work. I think this is where the decentralization, centralization problem is going to show up in spades, if I'm not mistaken. Asmer, Dustin, Asmer, yeah, go ahead.
I got an opinion, but it doesn't mean that it's right. So, like, judging from all that we saw in the past couple of weeks looking into this, I think that the identity should not really even exist in like formal terms. Like, the identity is just some vague description of their existing more data to the ID that's given. And the ID is the only thing that actually exists on the network, and everything else is tied to it. So the identity can be whatever you want, and can be different on different services, remotes, universes, whatever. The only thing that's unique between all those and connects all those is the single ID of that user, or the like start of the logbook, or whatever it becomes. And then everything kind of grows from there. So the identity should be completely separate from whatever is done with the data sets and how they operate and everything else. And you only attach some metadata in case you need it, wherever you need it.
Yeah, pretty much fully agree. When I say identity, I mean just an ID. And it's not like the identity has stuff. It's like other data structures point to that ID.
Yeah. So the ID is an identity is different from a key pair. And an identity is a thing that refers to, because we need an identity can have multiple key pairs, correct?
Are we talking about step 1, step 2, or step 3?
Great.
Like the way it has to work at first is like an identity is just, you know, an ID.
Mm-hmm.
The way key pairs work is you have a single, you know, key pair for your identity, like, or whatever, you know, your repository knows what your ID is, and it knows you have a key pair, right? So eventually we can add that multiple key pair feature, but that, like, trying to do that before both exists means that like the code is just not going to work.
Right. So I think in step 1, an ID, so we're just talking about let's pretend for a second that an ID is just some picked out of the sky, universally unique identifier. Is that fair? It's just like, hey,
yeah,
it's
sure.
And then for the purpose of discussion, so it's easy, it's just going to be, in this case, the number 1. So I have identity 1.
If I may, I feel like we should just be using profile ID. It's as arbitrary as any other decision, and you know we have existing client code out there right now that's using profile IDs, not in like major ways, but you know if we have like a different ID, there's all these questions like, does that mean we have to change dsref in order to start using this other ID? Like there's all these migration problems that prop up if we use something else.
Yeah.
Like profile ID exists, it has a well-defined meaning if you go with the one that I suggested, which is it's the ID that is created when you first create your first key pair. Yeah. Right. So, and that's compatible with future changes. Like if you have multiple key pairs, then fine.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that totally works.
Yeah, I think that's like the best argument for going with profile ID. Cloud is a little messy. I'll agree with that. But yeah, Asmir, did you have thoughts there?
Just a few small ones. I think it would be really helpful for everybody to just delineate like what different terms mean. In some contexts, identity means the whole profile, the user profile. In our case right now, the identity is literally just the profile ID, which is confusing because it's a profile ID, and we call it that way. Maybe we should call it something different. And then there's like key pairs, which are a third pair of thingies. So I just wanted to throw that out of the way. Profile ID, in terms of like using them like moving forward, I think they're a really good option because, as you said, all the infra is kind of already there and it's the least headache and as good as any. But we need to also define like what is the 0.0 for those profile IDs. For example, it's literally the issue I had today where I wanted to assign a temporary profile ID to a user because the user got signed up on cloud, which technically means that user is not really part of the network as they did nothing with their query repo, the IPFS thingy, nothing. which kind of beats the purpose of that profile ID 0. So that would be just a placeholder profile ID until they really join the network, which is a mishmash of stuff. And also prompts the issue, like later on, if we want to do multiple key pairs, who's now the like profile 0? Like if we want cloud to be able to be, to add its stuff on your behalf, that like temporary profile ID should kind of become the permanent one, and you should start assigning keys to that, because we would probably immediately assign a key that's allowed to sign those data sets and the ops on those data sets right then and there. Mm-hmm. So cloud created your repo initially, and that's number 0. I don't know.
I think that's fine.
What I want to say is we really need to sit down and just iron out all these like weird
little details,
flaps and edge cases, on what's the definition and what it should do. So I think the spec talk is really, really like hitting the nail on the head in terms of like what we need.
Totally. So I want to build on that. I think first and foremost, let's just run with this proposal that the identity, the ID, the actual string is just the thing that we currently call a profile ID. And on cloud, we would just invent them for people and we're the root. I think those are both totally fine. Where the rubber hits the road here is, and you mentioned, you briefly touched on it, Dustin, is a consistent method for naming stuff, basically the mapping of human readable names to these identifiers. We've had a number of ways that this works, but just to point out where this problem sort of hits user space is like unique usernames, right? So it is a unsolvable problem. It's not possible to solve the problem of having anybody be able to create an identity whenever they want and having universally enforced usernames and have the system be decentralized. Those three things, we either do something ridiculous, like we use a blockchain for this, or it's really untenable to have all three. It's often referred to as Zuko's triangle: human understandable, universally unique, and decentralized. Can have all three at once. So we've had a little bit of, what I'd like to propose for this is that and I think that's where the relationship gets really messy, because the original design of Logbook was to make this at least a little bit more tenable, where Logbook is actually the source of reference resolution. So what users want to be able to do is you want to be able to say, hey, I type B5/World Bank population, and there is a thing that is able to resolve that information really cleanly and easily. And B5 is arguably the most difficult thing to get right in this combination, because if I have a profile or a user or some sort of thing that I can attach as a delineation of a namespace, then the name of the data sets are all just collisions within themselves, and it's the same problem recursed down once, but it's not nearly as big a deal. So the question I want to put to everybody is like, how do we feel, Asbury, you pointed out that like in the beginning that you think that basically the meta information, right? B5 would, if I don't, stop me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but the name B5 is kind of meta information. It's associated, and it could be different in different places. And basically this gets to the sort of like IRC or Discord model of, you don't have universally unique usernames. Instead, you have a user, people can claim the same usernames. And what we really care about at the technical level is these identifiers. And those are the thing that really matter.
I think the easiest way to think, sorry to steal the answer. I think the easiest way to think about this is like the usernames are more of a UX thing, right? They're for like user convenience. And don't think of them as like globally unique. Think of them as you opt in to some remote who is like your semi-centralization point, and the usernames are going to be unique to that remote, right? So if everyone's using cloud and I'm in the mode where I sign up for Qri, I'm just using cloud and interacting with it that way, all usernames are going to be unique because they've all gone through cloud. When you start going into the P2P context, it's kind of the Wild West where, I could encounter someone someday that, never seen before, and they could have the same name as someone else I know. If I set up a, internal network in my company or a project or whatever, have a remote there and everyone's talking to that, then everyone talking to that remote is going to be the same username. And if you encounter that P2P problem where you see the same username in two places, we do the Discord thing where you have some hash and then a number that's derived from the profile ID, which we know is unique. but by definition, magic.
Mhm.
And that kind of allows you to disambiguate it, which again goes back to the idea that it's all about user experience, where you don't have to care about that hash, number stuff until you hit the point where you see the same textual username twice. So you kind of get like a mix of the two possible worlds where you'll have very convenient names for as long as possible. And then as soon as that becomes impossible, you have kind of this graceful degradation of that feature.
Just to add a couple points to that, there was a previous conversation we had on this topic, and I think Dustin really made a really great point. We need to separate logbook out of all the ref resolution stuff. Like logbook should be only concerned with the operations done to the data set, and the resolver should kind of be separate. At least that's what I caught from there. Might be wrong. But in any case, what I want to say is B5, yes, that should be meta, and the dataset name should probably also be meta, and we should just deal in the most primitive terms of different IDs, and there should be a resolver, a magic resolver living somewhere else, which should know the metadata associated with the dataset and being able to resolve for you. So in our case, this is here cloud. If it's another remote, it can have its own namespace and its own resolver, and it should know hey, this user is labeled as B5, and this is his World Bank population tests data set. I don't know. But all the data should be kind of attached to some sort of ID, and then we get to the point where we have duplicates in the same namespace, so on the same remote like cloud or something like that. You can preview a short truncated slip of his ID to kind of delineate those two users, and that's it.
Yeah, for me, this is a big sticking point because I really disagree with that. Parts of that. My challenge is the thing that we initially sort of tried to get Logbook to do. I thought it should be the source of reference resolution because we want to be able to do reference resolution in a peer-to-peer context, and reference resolution should be offline first. I do not think that it's okay that we could do some caching, or we could put this into a different system, which would just be completely saying, cool, let's do something else. But the way it's currently designed right now is, how does this work? Your logbook is your canonical source of data aside from the data sets itself. And so the way that you resolve a reference principally is off of the operational logs that describe the changes in names. So I think you could still have the disambiguation aspect of this, where you could end up with two users in your logbook that are both named B5, and then you would have exactly the technique you described for using exactly the technique for disambiguating them. So use some small hash, use some piece of the ID, and so basically pieces of the lower system start to creep up, and so you use identifiers to disambiguate stuff. But I really do think that the way the data set describes its name should be is actually not metadata. I think it's actually part of the data set definition itself, or the operational transform, the log that describes it itself. And I'm having a really hard time getting my head past that when we start to think about the peer-to-peer reference resolution context. Because what I really want to be able to do is give my logbook to somebody else, and that other person, and I want to sign all of those logs and then say, hey, this is a verifiable piece of information that came from a key pair that I control. And then other people can answer that question for me. So I can do reference resolution where I give all of my logbook history to Ramfox, and then someone asks Ramfox's node, hey, what's B5/World Bank population? And Ramfox will have an answer.
So I understand the use case. I think there's additional problems there that aren't necessarily solved. Like, how does that other user know to trust Ramfox to resolve your stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's questions of renaming. People can rename data sets, right? So the names aren't actually stable, and time gets involved where if a rename happens in one part of the network and a request comes in the other, what happens? We don't have really an answer for that. And
yes, we do. Well, that's the answer to that one but finish your point.
Oh no, go ahead.
The answer to that is the actual logbook operations, right? Like you add operations that change the name, and so you have the history of the whole thing.
Right, but I might not get those operations if they're coming in a different direction.
Yeah.
If logbook can be dispersed and all over the place.
Yep.
You know,
but if I get a reference resolution,
there's also a question of like, never mind.
Wanted to poke brains as well. So in the peer-to-peer context, is it the like name of the data set actually not really worth that much? Because like at the end, we're asking for somebody to provide us the ID of whatever string we type. So essentially they're trying to be a resolver, but in practice, we're requesting an ID and getting back stuff for that ID. And under the hood, it's all about those IDs. And the name is just a convenient way for us little humans to be able to convey to machines, like we want that part. Second to that, like on logbook, I mean, Qri already has an involved dataset model, like where we have like the structure components, the meta components and stuff like that. And all those operations you do are already signed by your private key and stuff like that. So kind of the data is already inside, or we could keep it inside. And logbook does, in that case, so it doesn't really have to care. And if we really explicitly want to like share ref resolution logic, that could be like a small, like, I don't know, sidecar system or something like that, which comes along. Like we have a small cache about like all the names of all the data sets living inside that logbook. And if you really interested in just ref resolution, you poke that specific tree. And otherwise you're just dealing with data, and that's where logbook is king.
Justin.
Yeah. Agree. Like to back that up, like I think it's important to look at like the main problem that logbook was solving to begin with, which is, you know, the activity itself on the changes to the data set, the versions we don't have. You know, for collaboration, like, you know, the different branches being worked on, things like that. And yeah, I agree with Asmir perspective there.
Yeah, I think I should be clear. I think reference resolution is a set of routines, it's a set of things that happen. The desynchronization issue shows up a whole bunch in a number of sort of naming-oriented systems. The classic way of dealing with this in peer-to-peer context is to ask lots of people and trust the most used result. The nice thing here is we have, because logbook is structured as an append-only thing, if you ever get back an ID, the ID has to match an actual log, and you know that because you can do the hash of the initial operation. And then the ID has to be signed, so you know that it came from a certain person. When you get that thing back, if it's shorter than somewhere else, then you know which one to prefer, right? And so we have a nice, this is query DNS. Yeah, this is literally like the DNS problem, right? Like it's mapping a naming system. And it's a really, really crucial thing to get right, because, and I don't think that it's like, I don't think it necessarily has to live in logbook, but it isn't trivial, because it's the entry point by which all of this happens. Like when I type an SQL query, that's a whole bunch of reference resolution happening, because I'm referring to a data set that I may or may not have. And the network may not have consensus about the name of the data set. As you said, Dustin, it may not be, I may ask somebody and get a different name, but I do have, if we do it correctly, whatever that means, it should be, you should be able to resolve to the intended self-described name of that data set, given n number of logs that describe that data set. So once you do find the most recent information, it should be very easy to figure out which one is the right one. There's always a chance that you'll get an old DNS name, but that's a problem in DNS, right? You have DNS propagation issues where when you ask a DNS server to resolve a name, it may give you an old IP address because it hasn't propagated the changes yet. And so I think it's less big a deal than it in practice than it is in theory. But I think it's really important to have the reference resolution mechanism be backed up by something that has a firm footing in some sort of cryptographic verifying technique. so that it can move around. As we like in the practical purposes, like Casey wasn't able to write peer-to-peer dataset exchange without a peer-to-peer reference resolution mechanism. And so if we rely on any kind of, we basically need some solution to the naming problem that can theoretically decentralize. And we sort of have one in this, but I think that it's the biggest problem here is that as we've rightfully pointed out, there's just like a whole bunch of collision of concepts that came along with that inclusion of that sort of responsibility in logbook. Does that resonate with others?
Just to be fair on the logbook concept, like I'm not against having reference resolution with it. It's just that I think that we need to like separate out that functionality from the like tracking version or like operations functionality. Those should be kind of like distinct. If it should travel in one piece and be part of one larger system that's called logbook, I think that's perfectly fine. It's just that I don't think like names are operations on data sets. Like if you update the name on a data set and commit that, that's an operation and we should record that into the logbook, like wherever that name lives. But the name itself and its resolution is like additional functionality, not the core functionality of logbook.
Agree on that. Like they are basically orthogonal concepts. The doc that I wrote about describing the current logbook system kind of talks about like these like opaque blocks that logbook doesn't really understand that just talk about things like name changes. I guess more the concern that I have, like I agree, you know, we need something to like make name resolution work across a P2P context. It's more a matter of like the code conceptually, like logbook as far as a way of coordinating changes to a dataset history mostly just cares about the stuff happening underneath it. Like the question of reference names is like a separate part.
It should be like incidental. It shouldn't be the primary goal of logbook, which should be to coordinate dataset history.
They're separate layers, right?
Yeah.
Down here is like what versions are there, right?
Yes.
And the name thing is kind of a separate thing. I think they're very intertwined. And it leads to problems where like a change happens, we have bad merges, we have a bunch of things. Just like conceptually, it's worth drawing them apart.
Absolutely. Well, this has been thoroughly head spinning. It is now 3 o'clock. In Eastern
Sorry.
No, I think it's really helpful. I wanted to get a lot of this on the table because, and it also I think it's worth having these conversations that are really hard and don't go anywhere very quickly, just to point to how difficult this problem set is. Like this is not easy stuff, and has been a pretty major blocker of a number of pieces of progress for us. And so I think time spent just sort of staring at this difficult wall. I feel like I've learned a thing or two here, specifically about some of the different positions that everybody's taking. And I think that we've arrived at some things that actually represent progress. If everyone's okay with the sort of thing that was proposed here, I'm really into the idea of the thing proposed here specifically being that usernames aren't actually unique. You can have multiple people named to B5, and there is a way to disambiguate them. And you really only run into that when you start seeing multiple B5s. Otherwise, you just get one, and that's fine.
Again, emphasize that is definitely a good place to be at, but it's a future place that we will be at.
Yeah, absolutely. We're speaking very specifically or very generally about the future here, not.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing the spec should talk about, I think.
Yeah.
Right, where it's like this is where we want to get to. Yeah.
Okay. Lovely. I don't want to take up too much more time. Thank you, everybody, for those of you who listened in on this. Well, effectively 3 of us debated. But before we sort of close, I'd love to open up the floor. Did any of this, was there anything that was percolating that anybody wasn't really talking, any questions that you had or anything that we could sort of speak to? I'd love to take just 2 minutes to make sure that we're not just like talking past people.
A little over my head, but I'm fascinated and I need a diagram. I want little arrows and, you know, try and understand how all these things are connected together. I get like 10% of it or something. But
I've enjoyed making diagrams time to time, so I might just do that if I feel the proper level of motivation. We'll see. No promises, but maybe.
Agree. Hard on diagrams required. Cool. Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it. This one was definitely very in the weeds. But thank you so much for listening. Cool. With that, see you around.